Hello and welcome to another Blender tutorial where we will create this. In this two-part series we will first create a cartoon shader, then we will use a Blender's built-in feature Fresstyle to create black ink outlines, and in the second part of this tutorial we will use Blender's compositor to create a watercolor effect and then put everything together and make it look like it's a painting on paper. Alright, there's a lot to do, so let's get started. Okay, first let's create the material. Now, if I take a diffuse shader and we look at the surface, we get a very soft, diffuse surface. But that's not what we want for our material. We want something that looks more like a cartoon style. So we could call the material that we're creating now a cartoon shader, or at least a very simple version of one. So we really don't want any of this soft shading. We want hard edges and just basically one color, and then maybe a darker one where the surface should be darker, like right here in the shadow areas, and then a lighter color for the highlight areas. So how do we do that? Well, there is a new node in 2.8 Eevee, and that's the shader to RGB node. So we can take a shader and plug it into this, and out comes a color. And this node is pretty crazy, and we'll see in a second why. And then the next thing we're going to take is a color ramp, set it to constant, and then we're just going to drag this into like 0.6 and add another node here. So let's go for something like a blue, okay? The first blue shadow shade that we take is this one. That's for the shadow areas. Then we copy this color, paste it in here, turn up the brightness a little, and then we paste it in here and turn up the brightness even more. So we have 3 distinct colors. And now using this setup here, we kind of get sharp edges here. So we have the shadow areas, and we can fine tune everything with these sliders here. Shadows, midtones here, and highlights. Of course, this all still depends on our lighting. So if I turn around this sun lamp, we get different looks. But you can see that everything now comes down to these 3 colors: a darker one, the main color, and a lighter one. Okay, and basically this is now plugged in directly into the surface, but basically what we want is an emission shader so that we get a flat rendering, just one flat, simple color. So that's what that looks like. And basically we're done, but although this is a usable, let's call it a cartoon shader, it is not very reusable. Because what if we want to turn this cube here into a red cube, but with the same principle that we have here? Well, we would have to give the cube a new material. So for example, copy this, call that red. Call the one on the monkey blue. And then on the cube, we would have to come in here, turn this red, and then take this color and make a darker one. Like this, and then paste it in here and make a lighter one. And then if we wanted to make this icosphere back here green, then we would have to do the same thing again. But of course, what we want is something reusable. We want to somehow put this together in a node group and then just plug in the color that we want. Now, the problem here is that the color ramp doesn't have any color input slots. But we can still use the same principle with a little bit of a hack to create a node group that we can reuse with just one color input. So let's see how we do that. So here's the material output, and we want to start with a color. Let's say with this red, paste that in here. We're still gonna need the diffuse, the shader to RGB, because everything here is based on this principle. Oh, and I said before that this node, this here, the shader to RGB node, is pretty crazy. And it is when you think about it, because what we see here now is Eevee is rendering this shader and then turning it into a color, using that color information to then render the whole image or the whole material surface again with this shader. This is, I think this is just mind-blowing that this works. Basically, we're rendering the surface twice, but we never see this output. Okay, back to creating a reusable node group. So here we get this output. Now let's take this color ramp 2, plug that in here, and turn these colors, or turn off the saturation, and make this first slot completely black, and take the middle one, make it a medium gray, 0.5 value, and then the last one completely white. And what we're gonna do here is we take a color gamma node and copy it, plug the color in here and in here. And if we look at it like this now, we can turn up the gamma to turn down the brightness, basically. And if we look at this one, we can turn down the gamma to turn up the brightness. And if we plug this into a color mix node with the brighter one on top and the darker one on the bottom, we now have a mix, and we can mix between the darker shade, and when we're at 0.5 here, we get the medium color shade, and then at 1 we get the brighter shade that we're creating with these two nodes here. And now all we need to do is plug this in here as the factor, and we're back to our Toon Shader setup. So if we plug this in an emission shader, this basically is the same thing now that we had before, but we now have one color input that we can change to green or yellow or whatever, and we still get this cool toon shading effect. And this, now let me just throw all of this away. And this here, all of this, we can put into a group. So Control G. Now this is in a group that we can clean up a little because we only want one color input. So we can delete this input. Okay, use one color input, do all that inside of our group, and our output is a finished shader. So now we have one node group that we can reuse, and we can even take this away and just put it in here. Let me call this Crispy Toon. So this is our very simple Toon shader. Now let's go back to the monkey, to our blue node setup. We can delete all of this. Shift A, group, Crispy Toon, plug it in here and make it blue. Now go to the icosphere, add a new material here, remove the principled, Shift A, group, Crispy Toon, surface, and make it green. Like so. And the result is we have a very simple cartoonish shader where the surface is always just 3 colors with very harsh edges between them, from the darker to the color that we actually plugged in, the medium brightness, and then a brighter version. Inside of this group, course, we can still go in here and fine-tune things. Maybe turn it like this a little, maybe make this even brighter. And this one even darker. Okay, and that's it for the shader. Now let's see how we can get those black ink outlines. And we do that by using a built-in feature which is called Fresstyle. Over here in the Render tab, we simply enable Fresstyle. Don't worry about these settings. And once we have enabled that, we have a whole bunch of options here in the View Layer tab. You can see here 3 new sections for Fresstyle, Fresstyle Line Set, and Line Style. Okay, the Fresstyle settings here we will not touch for now, that's fine. Here you can define 1 or more line sets. Fresstyle basically detects edges on your model and then renders lines or draws lines along those edges. And one line set, for example, can be thick lines on the outer edges, and then another line set could be smaller, thinner lines for other parts of the model. For this tutorial, we're just gonna go with one line set. Down here you have a whole bunch of options where you can select where the Fresstyle feature should draw lines. You can select by visibility, edge types, and all sorts of things. The default settings here draw ink lines for the silhouette, for the border, and for creases. You can play with all of these settings, and they're actually very, very useful. For example, for this image here, I've created 2 different line sets and then blended them on top of each other to get this sort of industrial design effect. But for now, I think we're just gonna leave this as default too. In the line style, you can now define for this line set what the line style is. And you can define the stroke. You can define a color, we're just gonna leave that black. You can define transparency. You can define thickness. We're gonna be playing with this a little. Geometry. You can add modifiers and textures. So without changing any settings here, I'm just gonna hit F12 and give this a render. And we can already see here, we get little tiny black strokes that look like somebody has drawn on them or painted on outlines with black ink. Okay, first thing I'm gonna do right away is go here to film and set this to transparent. And then in the Fresstyle settings, I'm going to turn up the thickness, which is by default 3. I'm gonna turn that to 5. You also notice how fast this is the rendering, the Eevee rendering, and then the black lines are rendered in a second pass and then put on top of your rendering. And the final result, if we go over to compositing, use nodes, you can see there is no separate pass here. It's all one final image. If I pull up an image editor here and take the render result. So the render result you get if you enable Fresstyle is always the image with the lines. And we'll find out how we can render the lines separately in a minute. Now let's go back here. Or actually I'm gonna stay here in compositing and go here into my Fresstyle line settings. Now I'm just gonna focus on the monkey head here because round surfaces always look very nice with those black outlines. So now 2 things that I want to change here to make the line look a little bit more interesting. In the line style setting here, I go to thickness and I'm going to add a modifier, a long stroke, set the mix to multiply and this type here to curve. And I'm going to put in a point over here, drag this one down, and you might already know what that does. So the Fresstyle feature basically draws a line. It finds the edge, like for example this curve here. It determines that it needs to draw this edge here, and then it draws one curve from start to finish. So this is start, this is finish. And this is the thickness. We're changing the thickness along the stroke. We start off with 0, then we have the full thickness area here, and then it goes back down to 0. We can also change this point to auto clamp handle to make it look a little smoother. And if I hit F12 again, this is what we get. And you can see how this stroke here starts off basically at 0 thickness, and then we have this thicker part, and then it tapers off to be very thin again. And each of these strokes here, each line that the Fresstyle feature figured out to draw has this stroke modifier on it now. Okay, this already looks very nice, I think. The second thing I did for the final rendering of the audio recorder was to randomize those lines even more over time, so that for each frame it looks like it has been drawn by hand. And if you draw the same thing over and over again by hand, it's always going to be a little bit different, in a different location, a little bit off. And we can do that by going to geometry and adding a modifier, a 2D offset modifier. And what does that do? Well, we have a stroke, a curve that's been drawn. We can shift the start and the end points, and we can shift the entire curve a little bit on the X and on the Y axis. And for animation, we want to modify this. So we go to the timeline. Hovering over here, I hit I on the keyboard to insert a keyframe on my first frame here for all of these 4 settings. And then we can go to animation, maybe bring this up, and in the graph editor over here, we have those 4 keyframes that we just set on the first frame. And now we can hit N to bring up the properties over here. Go to modifiers, add a noise modifier. So right now I'm putting noise onto the start point of this line style modifier to shift the start and the end point a little. So what do we want here? I'm going down to 0.2 scale to have crazy randomness. The strength I'm going to set to something like 5. So we're shifting the start point randomly 2.5 units up and down. And then we just turn up the phase. We just have to put in random numbers here. And then the same thing for the end. Add modifier, noise, strength 5, scale 0.2 to have it, really random. Different offset, just to drag it around a little so that they're not overlapping. So we have different random noise. And then again for the X, noise 0.3, strength, let's say 3 pixels, some random offset and phase. And for the Y, noise, scale, strength, also 3, offset, something and something. Okay, now we have 4 different random curves here, and they're changing our offset here for the line style. So the first frame we render, let's just render this quick. This is going to be the first frame. And now when I go to slot number 2 and jump forward 1 frame to frame number 2 and hit F12 again. Now I can switch between slot 1 and slot 2. And zooming in here, you can see we get a little bit of variation. So each frame in this animation will now have a little bit of a variation for each of those lines of the Fresstyle effect. Okay, now we have our shader. We have the lines, the outlines. On this cube, I have to say, it doesn't really look very interesting. So let me bring this over and scale these two models up a little, like so. Give that a render. By the way, if you want more or less of these lines, you can go in here and define a different crease angle. But honestly, I've found that the default settings look very nice for these technical things that I've played around with lately. Like I said before, the features here are pretty amazing. And for example, you can go into a mesh and define some edges, like for example, or let me go over here. And define, for example, these three edges, and then go to Edge, Mark Fresstyle Edge. So it looks like this. And when I hit F12 again, and enable Edge Mark, and hit F12 again, we tell Fresstyle explicitly where we want an edge to be drawn. And there's other cool features here that you can play with. One very useful one is this selection by collection, where you can put in a collection here and, for example, exclude a certain collection. And in combination with several line sets here, you can create different thicknesses, different colors, and all that kind of stuff, where you include or exclude collections or different edge features. So this is actually a very, very powerful tool here for creating ink outlines. And basically, we're done with our first part, where we created our shader and we set up the ink Fresstyle outline feature. All right, that is it for part 1. If you want to see part 2, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you get a message as soon as part 2 is available for you. Also, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with others. Thank you for watching. See you in part 2. Bye bye.